The dust of redemption Arizona settled on everything, a fine gritty powder that coated memory and hope alike. For Elias Vance, it was the dust of a life he'd tried to bury. 5 years. 5 years since the thunder of a gunshot had stolen his wife Elena and replaced the vibrant colors of his world with this perpetual sepia haze. He worked a small plot of land, now his hands once deft with a Colt peacemaker, now calloused from mending fences and coaxing life from the unforgiving soil. He was a ghost in his own life, a former U.S. Marshal haunted by the one law he could never enforce, the law of consequence. The morning broke like any other, with a sun that promised heat and a sky too vast and empty. But the rhythm of the town was shattered, not by the usual clang of the blacksmith's hammer, but by the sudden percussive thunder of hooves. They came from the east, a dozen riders moving with a discipline that spoke of something more than simple banditry. They were wraiths, their faces obscured by dust-caked bandanas, their movements economical and chillingly precise. Elias was in the general store trading a few eggs for coffee when the first shots cracked the air. They weren't wild shots. They were deliberate, aimed at the sky, a declaration of intent. Panic erupted. People scrambled for cover. Elias, however, stood frozen. The old instincts warring with the deep-seated desire to remain anonymous, to stay uninvolved. The riders fanned out their leader, dismounting with a fluid grace that was almost unnerving. He was tall and lean, dressed in black from his hat to his boots, a specter against the bleached-out street. He didn't stride into the bank. He flowed two of his men flanking him like shadows. Elias watched from the store's dusty window, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. This wasn't a common holdup. There was no shouting, no chaotic grabbing of money bags. It was quiet, surgical. The bank manager, Mr. Abernathy, was escorted from his office, his face ashen. The ghost in black said something to him, his voice too low to carry, and Abernathy, trembling, led him to the wall of security boxes. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, snaked its way up Elias's spine. The leader ignored the larger boxes, the ones belonging to the cattle barons and merchants. He moved with an unnerving certainty, stopping directly in front of box number 73. Elias's box. Time seemed to slow. The world outside the window faded to a dull hum. Elias could see the ghost figure insert the key Abernathy provided. He could see the small metal door swing open. The man reached inside, past the folded deed to Elias's ranch, past the few silver dollars he kept for emergencies. His gloved hand emerged, clutching a small silver locket. It was a simple thing tarnished with age. But to Elias, it was the repository of his soul. Inside was the only portrait he had of Elena, a miniature painted by a traveling artist a month before she died. Her smile, the light in her eyes, the gentle curve of her cheek, it was all he had left of her. The ghost in black didn't even glance at the money. He tucked the locket into his vest pocket, gave a crisp nod, and turned to leave. The operation had taken less than 5 minutes. As the gang mounted their horses, the leader paused, his gaze sweeping the street. For a heart-stopping second, his eyes dark and unreadable above the bandana seemed to lock directly onto Elias's through the window. It was a look of cold, intimate knowledge. Then he spurred his horse, and the phantoms, as they were known, melted back into the desert from which they came, leaving behind a stunned silence and the lingering smell of gunpowder. Elias stumbled out into the street, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He ignored the concerned calls of his neighbors. His world, already fragile, had been shattered anew. This wasn't a robbery. It was a message. Someone had reached into the deepest, most protected part of his past and ripped it out. The dust settled around his boots, but the storm inside him had just begun. The wounds he thought had scarred over were raw and bleeding again, and as he stared at the empty horizon, Elias Vance knew his self-imposed exile was over. He wasn't a rancher anymore. He was a hunter. The small cabin Elias called home was a testament to his brokenness. It stood alone at the edge of his property, a solitary structure against the vast, indifferent landscape. Inside it was sparse, meticulously clean, as if order could somehow ward off the chaos of his grief. A single tin plate and cup sat on a small table. A worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations lay on the nightstand, beside a bed that was always perfectly made. There were no photographs, no mementos, no clutter of a life, lived only the ghost of one. The empty space on the mantelpiece where the locket's wooden box had sat screamed its absence. In the days following the robbery, Elias moved through the town like a sleepwalker. He avoided eye contact, his answers to greetings clipped and distant. The townsfolk of Redemption treated him with a mixture of respect and caution. They knew the stories that he was once the most formidable marshal in the Arizona Territory, a man who brought in criminals others wouldn't dare pursue. They also knew that the death of his wife had extinguished the fire within him, leaving a man of ash and shadow. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-etched lines and weary wisdom, found Elias by his corral, staring at nothing. Brody was one of the few who remembered the old Elias, the friend he'd once shared whiskey and laughter with. "Heard about the locket," Elias Brody said, his voice gentle. He leaned against the fence, the silver star on his vest, catching the afternoon sun. "I'm sorry." Elias didn't turn. They knew where to look. The phantoms. Brody sighed, packing tobacco into his pipe. "They're different. Not your usual bunch of trigger-happy drifters. They hit targets all over the territory, banks, payroll wagons, land offices. But it's always specific. They take one thing, something that seems personal, and then they vanish. No tracks, no witnesses who can give a clear description. It's like hunting smoke." Elias remained silent, his jaw a hard line. "I know that look," Brody continued, lighting his pipe. "It's the same look you had when you went after the Clayton gang. Don't do it, son. This isn't your fight anymore." He took her picture, Brody. "He took the only thing I had left." The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of 5 years of unspoken pain. Before Brody could respond, another voice cut in, clear and steady. "Sheriff, Mr. Vance." It was Isabel, the town schoolteacher. She approached with a basket of bread, her expression one of composed sympathy. Isabel was pragmatic, intelligent, a woman who had carved out a life of purpose in a harsh land. She more than anyone seemed to see past the grieving husk to the man Elias had been. "I thought you might need this," she said, offering the basket to Elias. Her eyes held no pity, only a quiet understanding that was more comforting than any words of condolence. "The children ask about you. They miss you helping me fix the schoolhouse roof." Elias took the basket, his fingers brushing hers. For a moment, he felt a flicker of warmth, a connection to the life he had so deliberately shut out. "Thank you, Isabel." "Leave it be," Elias Brody said again, his voice firm. "Let the law handle it. This Silas Kane, the leader, he's a ghost. You go after him alone. You'll end up like all the others who've tried." Silas Kane. Elias's head snapped up. It was the first time he'd heard the name. "That's what they call him," Brody confirmed, though no one's ever seen his face and lived to tell of it. Elias looked from the concerned face of the sheriff to the quiet strength in Isabel's eyes. They represented the life he could have, a life of peace and community. But the ghost of Silas Kane had already claimed him. The theft of the locket wasn't just a crime. It was a summons. A specter from his past had called him out, and Elias knew he had no choice but to answer. He gave Isabel a small, sad nod of thanks and walked back to his cabin, the untouched bread in his hand, feeling as heavy as a tombstone. 2 weeks crawled by. Elias worked his ranch with a feverish intensity, trying to sweat out the rage and grief that simmered beneath his skin. But every sunset reminded him of Elena, and every sunrise brought a fresh wave of helpless fury. He was trapped in a holding pattern, a man of action with nowhere to direct it. The trail was cold, the desert vast. Chasing a ghost was a fool's errand. Then the desert sent him a sign. It arrived on the back of a half-dead prospector, a man named Jedediah, who stumbled into redemption, leading a lame mule, his shirt stained a dark, ugly crimson. He collapsed in the dust in front of the saloon, and a crowd quickly gathered. Elias was there in an instant, his old instincts taking over. He knelt beside the man, pressing a hand to the wound in his side. It was a deep, clean puncture. "Get the doc, Elias," yelled his voice, carrying the old ring of command. Jedediah's eyes fluttered open, milky with pain and delirium. He fumbled inside his coat, his fingers closing around something small and sharp. Phantoms. He rasped, his breath catching. "Ambushed me. At the old creek bed." His hand opened, and he pressed the object into Elias's palm. It was an arrowhead, but unlike any Elias had ever seen. It was carved from pure black obsidian, its edges honed to a razor sharpness. It was a beautiful, lethal thing. The calling card of Silas Cain. "Heard them." Jedediah coughed, a spray of blood speckling Elias's shirt. "The leader. He was talking about Sombra Canyon." The name struck Elias like a physical blow. Sombra Canyon. The words echoed down the dark corridors of his memory, a place of shadow and regret. It was where his life had fractured, the site of a violent confrontation 5 years ago that had set in motion the tragedy of Elena's death. It was a place he had sworn never to think of again. Sombra Canyon. Elias pressed, his voice urgent. What did he say about it? But Jedediah's eyes had gone vacant. A final shuddering breath escaped his lips, and he was still. Elias stared at the obsidian arrowhead resting in his palm. This was no longer a mystery. It was a reckoning. Silas Cain wasn't just a random outlaw terrorizing the territory. He knew Elias. He knew his history, and he was deliberately, methodically leading him back to the origin of his pain. He stood up, his decision made. The grief that had paralyzed him for 5 years had crystallized into a single sharp point of purpose. He walked past Sheriff Brody, who had just arrived on the scene. "Elias, wait," Brody called out, seeing the look on his friend's face. Elias didn't stop. He walked to his cabin, the murmurs of the townsfolk fading behind him. He pulled out his old gun belt from a dusty chest. The leather was stiff, but the Colt felt perfectly balanced in his hand. He checked the action, the familiar clicks, a grim communion with the man he used to be. He packed his saddlebags with ammunition, dried rations, and a canteen. He saddled his horse, a powerful buckskin named Ghost, with practiced efficiency. As he was about to mount, Brody caught up to him, his face etched with worry. "Don't be a fool, Elias. You don't even know where you're going." "Yes, I do," Elias said, his voice cold as a winter night. He swung into the saddle. "I'm going to Sombra Canyon." "You're going after Cain alone. It's suicide." "This isn't about the law," Brody, Elias replied, looking down at his old friend. "This is personal." He turned Ghost toward the setting sun and spurred him into a canter, leaving Sheriff Brody standing in the dust. He was no longer running from his past. He was riding straight into its heart, armed with a name, a destination, and a vengeance that had been 5 years in the making. The trail was easy to follow at first. The phantoms, for all their spectral reputation, were still a dozen men on horseback. They left a clear path through the sagebrush and across the sun-baked alkali flats. Elias pushed Ghost hard, riding through the night, guided by a sliver of moon. He was a man, possessed the fatigue of his body, nothing compared to the restless energy of his mind. Sombre Canyon loomed in his thoughts, a place of ghosts and gunfire. After 2 days of relentless tracking, he found their camp. It was nestled in a rocky arroyo, a remote outpost that offered a clear view of the surrounding terrain. Smoke curled lazily from a single campfire. Elias dismounted, tethering Ghost in a cluster of mesquite trees. He moved forward on foot, his steps silent, his body low to the ground. The skills of a U.S. Marshal were like a second skin, dormant, but never forgotten. He crept to the edge of the arroyo and peered down. The camp was strangely quiet. He saw only 3 men lazily drinking coffee around the fire, their rifles leaning carelessly against a rock. It felt wrong. Too easy. The phantoms were known for their discipline, their constant vigilance. His instincts screamed, "Trap!" He was about to pull back when a glint of silver caught his eye. On a flat rock near the fire, placed with deliberate care, was Elena's locket. Rage pure and blinding overrode his caution. They were mocking him, dangling the one thing he cared about like bait. He drew his Colt, the cold metal, a familiar comfort, in his hand, and began to descend into the arroyo. He was halfway down when the world exploded. Gunshots erupted from the rocks above him, bullets kicking up dust and whining past his head. The 3 men by the fire weren't bait. They were a distraction. The real ambush was laid in the cliffsides. Elias dove behind a cluster of boulders, the impact jarring his bones. He returned fire, his shots precise, aimed at the muzzle flashes. One of the hidden riflemen cried out and fell silent. But he was hopelessly outnumbered. Bullets chipped away at his cover, pinning him down. A searing pain shot through his left shoulder as a ricochet tore through his duster and into his flesh. He gritted his teeth against the pain, knowing he couldn't stay there. He had to retreat. Under the cover of his own suppressing fire, he scrambled back up the rocky slope, his movements fueled by adrenaline. He reached Ghost, bullets zinging past him, and swung into the saddle. He dug his heels into the horse's flanks, and they galloped away, the sounds of gunfire and mocking laughter fading behind them. He didn't stop until he was miles away, his shoulder a throbbing agony, his body slick with sweat and blood. He found a hidden spring and slumped to the ground, tearing a strip from his shirt to crudely bandage the wound. He had failed. He had walked right into their game and been thoroughly outplayed. Silas Kane wasn't just a bandit. He was a tactician, an intelligent, formidable opponent who knew Elias's every weakness. As he cleaned the wound, something fell from a fold in his duster. It was a single pristine bullet. He picked it up. It wasn't a rifle round from the ambush. It was a .45 Colt cartridge, the standard issue for a U.S. Marshal's revolver. It must have been slipped into his pocket or saddlebag sometime before the attack, a silent message left for him to find. Elias stared at the bullet in his hand. It was a chilling declaration. I know who you are. I know what you were. And I am always one step ahead. The hunt for Silas Kane had become a personal game of cat and mouse, and Elias was starting to fear he was the mouse. The wound in his shoulder was deep, and a fever was beginning to set in. Elias knew he couldn't continue alone. He needed help, and there was only one person in the territory he could trust, a man who operated outside the law, but lived by a code of honor stricter than any statute. His name was Nokona, an Apache tracker to whom Elias had once shown mercy, a decision that had cost him a commendation, but earned him a life debt. It took him another day of riding his body racked with pain to reach the remote, hidden canyon where Nokona lived in self-imposed solitude. He found the old man sitting outside his wickiup, carving a piece of wood. Nokona's face, a mask of wrinkles and quiet dignity, showed no surprise at Elias's arrival. He simply looked at the blood-stained bandage and nodded toward the dwelling. "The white man's justice has wounded you again," Vance Nokona said, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. Inside, Nokona cleaned and stitched the wound with practiced hands, applying a poultice of herbs that immediately cooled the fire in Elias's shoulder. As he worked, Elias told him everything about the locket, the phantoms, the obsidian arrowhead, and the name that haunted him, Sombra Canyon. Nokona listened without interruption. When Elias finished, the old tracker stared into the fire for a long moment. "This Silas Kane is not a common thief," he said. "He hunts with a purpose. He leaves a trail for you, then lays a trap. He wants you to follow. He wants you to know why you are being hunted." "Can you help me track them?" Elias asked. "They move like smoke." "They are men, not spirits," Nokona replied. "They leave signs for those who know how to read them. My debt to you is not forgotten. I will help you." For the next week they traveled together. Under Nokona's tutelage, Elias began to see the desert not as an empty expanse, but as a book filled with stories. A broken twig, a displaced stone, the faintest scuff of a shod horse on rock, Nokona missed nothing. He taught Elias to think like the hunted, to anticipate his enemy's movements. Their journey became an investigation. They found the remnants of the Phantom's other raids. At a burned-out railroad way station, they discovered that the only things stolen were shipping manifests and land deeds, all belonging to the Great Western Railroad Company. At a ransacked land office, only the files pertaining to homestead claims along the San Pedro River were taken. A pattern was emerging. Silas Kane wasn't just robbing. He was erasing the records of a specific company's expansion. The San Pedro River, the Great Western Railroad. The names resonated with a sickening familiarity in Elias's memory. The violent land dispute 5 years ago, it had been between homesteaders on the San Pedro and the Great Western. And Elena. She had been a journalist for a small territorial newspaper, writing a series of articles about the dispute, giving a voice to the ranchers being pushed off their land. Her death, an apparent casualty of a stray bullet during a street fight, had always felt wrong. Too random. They finally caught a break near the Mexican border. They found a lone rider separated from the main gang, nursing a lame horse. He was young, barely a man, with fear in his eyes. Elias and Nokona took him by surprise. There was no fight. Tied to a tree, the young outlaw was defiant at first. But Elias was no longer the man who lived by the book. He pressed the cold obsidian arrowhead against the boy's cheek. "Silas Kane." Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. "Tell me about him. Tell me what this is all about." The boy's bravado crumbled. "We're just following orders," he stammered. "Kane, he pays well. He says we're getting justice." "Justice for what?" "For what the railroad did to his family," the boy whispered. "They took everything. Their land, their water, their lives." "His family," Elias pressed. "What was their name?" The boy hesitated, then spoke the name that would shatter Elias Vance's world and reframe his entire past. "Kane," the boy said. "His older brother was Daniel Kane, the homesteader, the one the marshal gunned down 5 years ago in Sombra Canyon." The world tilted on its axis. The desert air, thin and hot, suddenly felt thick and suffocating. Daniel Kane. A name from a faded report, a ghost from a past he thought he had buried. Elias stumbled back from the young outlaw, his mind reeling, the pieces of the last 5 years clicking into place with a horrifying, sickening finality. He remembered it all now with a clarity that felt like a fresh wound. He, a U.S. Marshal, had been hired by the Great Western Railroad. They'd called it keeping the peace. Their lawyers had presented him with warrants and sworn affidavits painting Daniel Kane as a violent agitator, a squatter who was terrorizing railroad surveyors and refusing to vacate land he had no legal claim to. They had shown him reports of ambushes and threats, all attributed to Kane and his fellow homesteaders. It had all seemed so clear, so black and white. He had ridden into Somber Canyon with a posse not for a discussion, but for an eviction. Daniel Kane had met them not with a mob of armed men, as the railroad had claimed, but alone, his face etched with a desperate resolve. He had a rifle in his hands, but it was held loosely a tool of a rancher, not a killer. "This is our land," Marshal Daniel had said, his voice steady despite the overwhelming odds. "We have deeds. The railroad forged theirs." Elias, full of the righteous certainty of the law, hadn't listened. He'd seen only the rifle, the defiance. He'd given the order to stand down. Daniel had refused. A shot was fired, Elias could never remember by whom, and the canyon erupted in violence. In the confusion, he and Daniel had faced each other. Daniel had raised his rifle, and Elias, reacting on instinct and the railroad's lies, had drawn his Colt and fired. He remembered the look of shock on Daniel's face, the way he crumpled to the ground, his life bleeding out into the red dust of the canyon floor. And watching from the rocks above, hidden from view, had been a boy. A young teenager with his brother's dark hair and fierce eyes, witnessing his hero, his only family, being cut down by a man with a silver star on his chest. "Silas Kane, he believes you're a murderer," the captured outlaw said, his voice barely a whisper, seeing the dawning horror on Elias's face. "He thinks you were a hired gun for the railroad, the man who helped them steal his family's land and destroy their lives. This whole thing, it's for his brother. He's taking revenge on the railroad and on the man who pulled the trigger." The truth was a physical blow. Elias sank to his knees, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. He hadn't been an instrument of justice. He had been a tool, a pawn in a corporate land grab manipulated by falsified information and his own rigid adherence to a law that had been twisted to serve the powerful. The hero of his own story was the villain in Silas Kane's. And Elena, her investigation into the railroad, her championing of the homesteaders. Her death was no longer a random tragedy. It was a loose end tied up by the same people who had hired him. He had been mourning a stray bullet when he should have been hunting for an assassin. Silas Kane wasn't a ghost haunting him. He was a product of Elias's own past, a living embodiment of his greatest failure. The rage that had driven him from redemption evaporated, replaced by a profound and suffocating guilt. The locket wasn't stolen as an act of simple revenge. It was a symbol. Silas had taken the memory of Elias's lost loved one, just as Elias had taken his. Nokona placed a hand on his shoulder. The old Apache's eyes held no judgment, only a deep, sorrowful understanding. "The path of vengeance is a circle," he said quietly. "It leads only back to the beginning." Elias looked up, his face a mask of anguish. The hunt for Silas Kane was no longer about reclaiming a locket or seeking retribution. It was about confronting the man he had created, and in doing so, confronting the lies he had built his own life upon. He had to face him, not to kill him, but to understand the full, terrible scope of the injustice he had set in motion 5 years ago in Somber Canyon. Word traveled fast in the desert. Whether through the whispers of prospectors or the smoke signals of unseen watchers, Silas Kane soon learned that Elias Vance knew the truth. And with that knowledge, the game changed. It was no longer a subtle chase across the territory. It became a direct, brutal confrontation. Silas and the phantoms rode into redemption. But they didn't come to rob the bank or shoot up the saloon. They came to deliver an ultimatum, and their methods were cruel and symbolic. They bypassed the town's defenses, entering under the cover of a moonless night, like the specters they were named for. The town awoke to a nightmare. The general store, the heart of the community, was a smoking ruin, its contents burned to ash. The troughs for the horses had been filled with oil. And worst of all, the town well, their only source of fresh water for miles, had been poisoned, a dead coyote floating in its depths as a grim warning. There was no note, no verbal threat left behind. There didn't need to be. The message was clear, written in destruction and fear. This was Silas Kane's doing, and it was because of Elias Vance. The townsfolk gathered in the street, their faces a mixture of fear and growing anger. They looked at the smoldering store, at the useless well, and then they looked at Elias, who stood apart, the weight of their suffering on his shoulders. "This is your fault, Vance," a merchant shouted, his life's work gone up in smoke. "This phantom is hunting you, and he's tearing our town apart to get to you." Sheriff Brody tried to calm the crowd, but the fear was too potent. "We don't know for sure it was Kane," he argued, but his words lacked conviction. "Who else would it be?" Isabel's voice cut through the noise. She stood on the steps of the schoolhouse, her face pale but her gaze steady. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She was looking directly at Elias. Her look wasn't one of accusation, but of appeal. Then a rider appeared at the end of the street. It was one of the phantoms, a white flag tied to his saddle horn. He stopped 100 yards away, a safe distance, and his voice carried in the morning stillness. "A message from Silas Kane," he shouted. "He will dismantle redemption piece by piece. He will burn every building and salt every field. This will continue until the man who calls himself Elias Vance faces him, alone, at Sombra Canyon, 3 days from now, at sundown." The rider wheeled his horse and galloped away, leaving the ultimatum hanging in the air like a death sentence. The choice was no longer his. Silas had taken it from him. This wasn't just about his personal quest for redemption anymore. It was about the lives of the people of redemption. He could ride away, let them suffer for his past sins, or he could walk into the canyon where it all began and face the ghost he had created. He looked at Brody's worried face, at the anger and fear of his neighbors, and finally at Isabel. In her eyes, he saw the question that mattered most. Who was he going to be, the broken man, hiding from his past, or the marshal who protected the innocent? "It's all right, Brody," Elias said, his voice calm and resolute. He walked through the silent crowd, his path clearing before him. He stopped in front of Isabel. "Don't go," she whispered, her pragmatism finally giving way to fear for him. "It's a trap. He'll kill you." Maybe, Elias said, his gaze holding hers. "But if I don't go, he'll kill this town. Some things you can't run from." He turned and walked toward his cabin. He wasn't riding to Sombra Canyon for revenge. He wasn't going for a locket. He was going to atone, to end the cycle of violence he had started. He was going to answer for the death of Daniel Kane, and in doing so, save the town that had given him shelter from himself. The sky over Sombra Canyon was bruised purple and gray, the air thick with the metallic scent of an approaching storm. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl that seemed to emanate from the very rocks themselves. Long, distorted shadows danced across the canyon floor, turning familiar formations into monstrous shapes. It was a place that lived up to its name, Canyon of Shadows. Elias rode in slowly, his hands held high and away from his gun. He was not here as a lawman or an executioner. He was here as a penitent. Silas Kane was waiting for him in the center of the canyon, standing on the exact spot where his brother had fallen. He was no longer a ghost obscured by a bandana. He had the same dark hair and piercing eyes as Daniel, but his face was younger, hardened by a grief that had festered into a cold, precise rage. In his hand, he held Elena's silver locket, letting it swing gently on its chain. "You came," Silas said, his voice quiet but echoing in the heavy air. "You left me no choice," Elias replied, dismounting. He walked forward until they were 20 paces apart, the traditional dueling distance. "You always have a choice." Marshal Silas countered the title a venomous accusation. "You had a choice 5 years ago. You chose to believe the lies of rich men. You chose to murder my brother." "I was wrong," Elias said, the confession costing him everything, and yet freeing him in a way he hadn't thought possible. "I was given false information. I acted on a lie. Your brother was an innocent man, and I took his life. There is no excuse for what I did." A flicker of surprise crossed Silas's face, but it was quickly replaced by the familiar mask of hatred. "An apology? Is that what you offer in exchange for a life? It's too late for apologies." "I'm not here to apologize," Elias said, his voice steady. "I'm here to end this. It stops now. With us." "It ends when justice is served," Silas retorted, his hand drifting toward the gun on his hip. "But before it does, you deserve to know the whole truth. You see, you and I are more alike than you know. We both lost everything because of the Great Western Railroad." He tossed a small leather-bound journal into the dust between them. "My brother kept a journal. He documented every threat from the railroad, every forged deed. But there was someone helping him, a newspaper reporter who was brave enough to listen. She was gathering her own evidence, preparing to expose the whole corrupt enterprise." Elias's blood ran cold. He knew what was coming. "Her name was Elena Vance," Silas said, his eyes boring into Elias's. "The railroad baron, a man named Blackwood, couldn't have a marshal's wife exposing his crimes. So while you were busy being his hired gun, he sent his own men to silence her. Her death wasn't an accident, Marshal. It was an execution, ordered by the same man who paid you to kill my brother." The world dissolved into a roar of thunder and grief. It was the final devastating piece of the puzzle. The true villain wasn't Silas. The true villain was a man in a tailored suit named Blackwood. "I didn't just want revenge on you." Silas continued, his voice rising with the wind. "I wanted justice. I've spent the last year gathering all the proof. My brother's journal, the railroad's stolen ledgers, sworn affidavits from men who were too scared to speak before. I sent it all to a federal judge in Prescott 2 days ago. Blackwood's empire is finished." He paused, a grim satisfaction on his face. "My final act was to get a confession from the man who pulled the trigger. You've just given it to me." A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the canyon, followed by an immediate deafening crack of thunder. In that split second, Silas drew his gun. It was chaos. Elias reacted on pure instinct, his own Colt seeming to leap into his hand. The gunfight was not a clean, honorable duel. It was a frantic, desperate exchange of fire amidst the roaring storm. Flashes of lightning revealed their positions, while thunder masked the sound of their shots. A bullet tore through the sleeve of Elias's coat. Another kicked dust into his eyes. He fired back, not to kill, but to disarm, to end the violence. He saw an opening as Silas moved between 2 boulders. Elias fired the bullet, striking the rock just beside Silas's hand. The impact sent Silas's pistol flying into the darkness. Elias closed the distance, his own gun leveled at the now unarmed Silas. Rain began to fall in heavy cold sheets, plastering their hair to their faces. They stood there, two men bound by a shared tragedy, their faces illuminated by the strobing lightning. Silas stared at him, his chest heaving, expecting the final shot. "Do it," he spat. "Finish what you started." Elias looked at the young man before him, seeing not a monster, but a boy, whose life had been stolen just as his own had. He saw the reflection of his own pain, his own quest for vengeance. And he saw the choice Nokona had spoken of. He could continue the circle, or he could break it. Slowly, deliberately, Elias lowered his gun. "No," he said, his voice clear above the storm. "The killing ends here. It ends with us." The storm broke as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean. The first rays of dawn were breaking over the canyon rim as Sheriff Brody and a posse of townsmen rode in, their expressions grim. They had followed Elias, fearing the worst. They found the two men sitting on opposite sides of a small sputtering fire that Elias had managed to build. They weren't enemies anymore. They were just two exhausted survivors of a war that had finally ended. Silas was in custody, but there were no shackles. He had surrendered willingly. Elias stood as Brody approached. He held out two objects. In one hand was Elena's locket, which Silas had left for him on a rock. In the other was a weathered letter pulled from Silas's coat. It was a signed confession from one of Blackwood's former employees, detailing the order to kill Elena. "Blackwood Elias," said, his voice hoarse. "It was always Blackwood. Silas has already sent the rest of the proof to Judge Miller." Brody took the letter and the locket, his old eyes full of a sorrowful understanding. What happened here 5 years ago?" Elias looked over at Silas, who met his gaze without hatred for the first time. Then he turned back to his friend. "I was an agent of the Great Western Railroad, Brody. I acted on falsified warrants. I killed an innocent man named Daniel Kane." He took a deep breath, the confession both a burden and a release. "I'm prepared to give a full statement. I'll testify to everything." The scene was quiet, somber. The posse members who had come ready for a bloody battle stood in awkward silence, witnessing not the end of a manhunt, but the beginning of a painful, complicated justice. Silas was escorted away, not as a vicious outlaw, but as a key witness. As he passed Elias, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, a truce, an ending. The cycle of vengeance was finally truly broken. Months passed. The wheels of federal justice, though slow, ground exceedingly fine. Armed with Silas Kane's evidence and Elias Vance's damning testimony, the case against Mr. Blackwood was airtight. The railroad baron was arrested, his empire of corruption dismantled. The homesteaders of the San Pedro River had their land rights restored. In light of the circumstances and his cooperation, Silas Kane received a reduced sentence for his crimes, his actions recontextualized not as simple banditry, but as a desperate, violent quest for justice. The town of Redemption began to heal. With funds seized from Blackwood's assets, the general store was rebuilt with a well-purified. The scars remained, but a sense of peace settled over the community. Elias stood before Elena's grave on a quiet, sun-drenched afternoon. The simple wooden cross was weathered but strong. For years, this place had been a shrine to his guilt. Now it felt different. He opened the silver locket and looked at his wife's smiling face one last time. He saw not a victim of random violence, but a brave woman who had died fighting for the truth. With a sense of finality, he closed the locket and gently placed it on the headstone, leaving it to rest with her. It was an act of letting go not of her memory, but of the grief and guilt that had defined him for so long. It's a beautiful spot. He turned. Isabel stood a few feet away, her presence a quiet comfort, not an intrusion. She carried no basket of bread, offered no words of pity. She was simply there, a friend offering support. She would have liked you, Elias said, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, before turning to walk back toward the town. As they reached the edge of the cemetery, Sheriff Brody was waiting for them. He held out his hand. In his palm lay a polished silver star, Elias's old marshal's badge. "The territory could use a man like you again," Brody said, "the man you are now." Elias looked at the badge, the symbol of a life of honor and of terrible mistakes. He thought of the weight of it, the responsibility it carried. He took the star from Brody's hand, its familiar heft a memory in his palm. He looked at the peaceful town of redemption, at the schoolhouse, where children were learning, at Isabel, standing beside him. He didn't pin the badge on his chest. Instead, he slipped it into his pocket. It was a part of him, a part of his past he no longer needed to run from or be defined by. He would carry its lessons forward, but on his own terms. He was not Elias Vance, the haunted marshal. He was not Elias Vance, the broken rancher. He was just Elias, a man who had walked through the valley of shadows and emerged into the light, ready to build a new life, not as a legend or a ghost, but as a man who had finally found his own redemption. He turned to Isabel, and together they walked toward the town.